public hearing today. The purpose of the hearing is pretty narrow. It's to make the public aware that the YMCA building is eligible to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places and collect public comment regarding its demolition in the near future, or in the future. I just wanted to do a quick introductions to who we have up here. Again, I'm Rebecca Hall. This is Blair Hecker in Community Engagement. You want to go ahead?
I'm Vicki Berenberg, the City Historic Preservation Officer.
Eric Cockley, Director of the Planning and Community Development Department.
Chuck Knowles, Project Manager.
And I'm Jennifer Hall, Transit Superintendent.
Okay. And we're going to go ahead and get started with our presentation. Chuck Knowles and Jennifer Hall, if you want to talk a little bit about our project that is related to this meeting.
Sure. Just a brief background about the transit facility and the parking garage. It's proposed as a 5-story parking structure, approximately 220,000 square feet total. The 105,000 square feet of this dedicated to the transit facilities include 5,000 square feet that will be on the ground floor, that will be occupied by Frankfort Transit staff, and also there will be a public waiting area on that first floor also. The other 123,000 square feet will be used by the city for public parking, covered parking spaces. The estimate for this entire project about 18 months ago was $8.5 million, and we're also pursuing a $5.5 million Federal Transit Administration grant to complement the funds that the city will also provide for its design and construction. Jennifer, you want to tell a little bit more about the transit?
Yeah, so the transit facility we're very hopeful for. It will have offices for all of our staff. It will have a staff lounge, which if you're familiar with the current situation, we have a large outdoor transfer space on Clinton Street, and our drivers currently, since the YMCA has shut down, they don't even have a restroom available to them right now. So they're having to go to the farmer's market and use the facilities there, which is a porta-john. So we're very excited to be able to offer them a lounge area and a restroom area, as well as our passengers. When they transfer, they'll have a restroom area. They'd also have our training room would be located there. The dispatch office would then be there, so our dispatchers will be able to see our drivers. Our current location is on Bald Knob Road in the way back next to the streets department. And so we are very much away from our public, and we're very much away from our drivers as they are going through their day-to-day operations. So this will help to solidify something that's more centered within the community. The training center will also have a public waiting area that will include restrooms for them, vending machines. It will include an air-conditioned location, so in the heat, they're not hot, and of course in the winter they won't be cold any longer. And it will also have ticket machines in the future. We would like to eventually go to a cashless system. So especially with COVID, we can see how nice that would be to have something that's non-touch for our drivers and our passengers. So in the future, that would be there. We would also like to open up this area to the community as far as for tourism, for example. Imagine if you get into this parking structure, you come down the elevator, you go into this really large, beautiful area, and there's brochures about what our community has to offer in the area. There's a person that's there that can help to direct you to the different transit facilities or mobilities that we have available. The parking structure would have an area for park and ride people that would like to come into the community, and maybe they're going to Lexington, or maybe they're going to Louisville, or vice versa. It would be an inner city connection for the Miller transportation. It would also serve as a connection for BG Cap, which currently has a route that goes from Frankfort to Lexington and Lexington to Frankfort. So it would really be central to a lot of different opportunities for people within the city limits and for outreaching. And that's it in a nutshell.
And Eric's going to talk a little bit about, our transit facility and parking garage is just a small part of a larger development, which is part of the reason we're here. So I know this is really hard to see, but this is the development vision, and Eric's going to tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. So as Rebecca said, we're here specifically today to solicit public comment about the demolition of the old Y as part of this broader development project, but specifically as it relates to the FTA grant for our transit center and parking garage, which is, as Rebecca mentioned, a portion of a broader development vision as has been submitted to us. And so what you'll see, of course, the bottom two yellowish buildings proposed there on that lot, that's what we refer to as parcel C, which is the location of the current Y and associated parking garage. Above that, there's a pink box, which is the proposed general location of the transit center and parking garage that will be the city's most active participation in the project. Moving east from there, there's the extension of Washington Street, which will as part of this connect from Broadway to Clinton and then from Clinton to Miro and reintegrate the former historic street grid of the downtown that was, as part of urban renewal, removed. Along that that proposed reconstructed Washington Street right away between Clinton and Miro, there'll be some mixed-use buildings with some retail, business, possibly live units above, professional office, things of that nature. On the north side of that, they've currently proposed a new YMCA facility, if all that works out. And then moving to the east, the use in the mixed-use development as proposed would then transition from those mixed uses in the professional office and commercial into multifamily residential units. Obviously, this is a vision. There'll be a number of steps before construction of the private project elements happen. All the necessary processes with planning and zoning and things of that nature will still have to occur, both with zone changes, development plans, any subdivision planning that might have to occur as lots are cut up and things of that nature. So, but that's the broad vision for redevelopment as the developer sees it at this time for the broader project.
And our Historic Preservation Officer, Vicki Bernberg, is going to now talk to us a little bit about why we're here tonight.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here. So Chuck mentioned earlier when he was speaking that this project kind of hinges on the receipt of a grant in the amount of $5.5 million from the Federal Transit Administration, which is a federal agency. And you may or may not be aware that when federal agencies either issue grant funding or permits for activity across the nation, they have responsibilities to ensure that they've considered a project's impacts, either environmentally or on cultural and historic resources. This is required under the National Historic Preservation Act, which was passed in 1966, and also under the National Environmental Protection Act, which was passed in 1970. Prior to that, there was a lot of federal money spent across the country, and including in Frankfort, right, without these types of considerations and conversations. Eric mentioned the urban renewal funding that created Capitol Plaza, right, back in, well, actually that project started in the mid-1950s, the slum clearance and redevelopment portion. So that was prior to the passage of these acts, and all of that destruction took place probably without any sort of conversation about what that meant to the community that was living there at the time. But now we have these federal laws in place, and there's a process we have to follow. And because the Y is part of this development plan that includes federal funding, even though it's not directly impacted by the federal funding, we still have to have this conversation about the Y as a cultural resource to Frankfort and what it means to the community. So, let's talk a little bit about the why in particular. You want to go to the next slide? It is located at 402 West Broadway, right? It was built in conjunction with the Capitol Plaza Tower complex in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And it recently had a birthday that made it 50 years of age, and that's the reason we're having this conversation, because generally speaking, resources can't be considered historic until they cross that threshold of 50 years. So as part of the project review for the Transit Center, FTA looked at a survey of resources in the vicinity of the project, and they determined that the Y was eligible for the National Register, and they forwarded that determination to the State Historic Preservation Office, which is the Kentucky Heritage Council, and KHC concurred with that determination. So let's talk a little bit, so you have an understanding of how we determine, or how it is determined, that resources are eligible for the National Register. Again, generally speaking, unless a property is really exceptional, it must be 50 years old to be considered eligible. And then the National Register has 4 different criteria it uses by which they evaluate and determine whether a property is eligible for listing. And these 4 criteria are simply A, B, C, and D. Criterion A, if it meets that criterion, the property is associated with events that have made significant contributions to the broad patterns of our history. Criterion B, that's the famous person criteria. The property is associated with significant people, either locally or statewide or nationally, significant people to our past. Criterion C means that, well, that one's for architecture. It means the property embodies the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, or it might represent the work of a master or famous architect, or possess high artistic values, or taken as a whole, as in maybe a district, right? It represents a significant and distinguishable entity whose components individually maybe don't have that significance by themselves. And then criterion D, that's the archaeology criterion, which means that the property has yielded or may be likely to yield information important to prehistory or history. So the Y has been determined eligible for the National Register under criteria A and C. It's eligible under criterion A for its association with community development in the local historic context of social organizations in Frankfort, of which the YMCA is one. It also has been determined eligible under criterion C as a good example of late mid-century modern public architecture in Frankfurt. The building was designed by Gray, Coblin, and Porter, which was a local architectural firm. It was built in 1969. That firm also designed a building at 125 West Main, which is where the current West Banco is located. The YMCA, it shows the influence of the brutalist style, which is associated with the late 60s and early 70s. It's a style that is kind of a very monumental, it has monumental qualities. It's big, right? It has a big presence. It also has sculptural qualities. The style is known for being kind of dramatic and bold, and there's also generally a heavy use of the material concrete in construction. Actually, brutalism comes from the French word béton brut, which means raw concrete. So it was a style that was very popular during its heyday to design a lot of civic buildings, also government and educational buildings. Concrete was kind of a cheap way to get a lot for a little bit of money, which is one reason it was so popular. My alma mater for undergrad at Northern Kentucky University, if you've ever been to that campus, has a lot of brutalist buildings. So because the transit facility is closely related to the other aspects of the redevelopment of parcels B and C, including the demolition of the Y, the Federal Transit Administration is interested in hearing public comment regarding the National Register eligibility of this building and how you feel about demolition.
So we'll now take public comment. We have a sign-in sheet up here. If you did not get to sign up, there should be another one back there. And Blair is going to time you. Everyone has 5 minutes. She'll give you a 1-minute warning. So let's see, first person up is?
We have Nicole Conkle.
Hi. Thanks for allowing the public a moment to speak. I'm Nicole Conkle. I am the chair of the Architectural Review Board here in Frankfort. And under Article 17 D and E, the ARB is tasked with acting in an advisory role to officials and departments of local government regarding protection of cultural resources and acting as a liaison between individuals and groups interested in historic preservation. That's kind of how I'm hoping to help with some comments this evening. So I wanted to take a couple of minutes to point out a few common key concepts used in navigating the process that we are at now. And I get that this is a public comment period, but please indulge me, because if this turns out to be the only chance to make a public comment, I want to run through this 2 minutes tops. As Vicki already stated, any project involving federal money or lands requires that historic properties be considered. So under the process we're navigating, there's actually no difference in the treatment of historic properties that are considered eligible or for properties listed on the National Register. So a historic property eligible or listed on the National Register can be demolished. There are no federal protections in place just because a property is eligible for listing on the National Register. So under the National Historic Preservation Act, the process we're currently navigating, this would be considered an adverse effect, the demolition of the Y. So adverse effects to properties under consideration can and do happen every day, but the lead federal agency mitigates or offsets these effects by supporting neighboring, relevant, or similar preservation concerns. An adverse effect to one historic property must be balanced by investment in another historic property or preservation project important to the community. So in short, one of two things ultimately occurs when you're looking at something under NHPA or NEPA if you are coordinating those two federal laws. The property currently being discussed will be found ineligible for listing, and as such, the consultation process surrounding this property will pretty much come to a close. Or, in the case that we're discussing this evening, once a property is determined eligible for listing on the National Register, at that point it will become incumbent upon the Federal Transit Administration to balance any treatment, including but not limited to demolition of the property being discussed, with preservation interests of the community, and to continue a conversation with consulting parties and the public until a reasonable balance to preservation in the community has been met. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have John Carlton.
Good evening. My name is John Carlton. I'm the president of the Franklin County Trust for Historic Preservation. I'm here tonight to discuss the future of the YMCA structure. We recognize that the YMCA's age, constructed in 1969, has triggered the Federal 106 review process to evaluate the significance of the structure, if any, and if the building is worthy of preservation. Given the application for federal grant funds and the redevelopment of the former plaza, we appreciate and commend the city for undertaking this federally mandated process and including the public and our organization in a conversation about the structure and its future. Being now more than 50 years old, the YMCA may be eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. This review process should always be used in evaluating places before they are compromised to determine historic assets that are worthy of preservation for their significance to national, state, or local history. However, eligibility based on age alone does not determine listing, and in review, we believe the integrity of the YMCA to be compromised by the demolition of the rest of the larger Capitol Plaza complex, making its listing and preservation unlikely. The building of the YMCA was part of a process that resulted in the blanket destruction of a historic neighborhood. Today, that would not have been possible without a process just like this with thoughtful public input mandated by the federal government. We have been an advocate throughout this redevelopment process to interpret what has been lost and to see the historic street grid recreated through the proposed new development, including Washington Street, which was lost in the 1960s. The current structure competes with the overall architectural style, scale, and walkability of historic downtown. Recreating this historic street grid pattern will better support a walkable and human-scaled neighborhood as defined in the downtown master plan. Because of these reasons, we do not support the physical preservation of the YMCA structure. Instead, if the building is removed, we request that any attempts for mitigation be given to documenting the current structure, interpreting the lost historic neighborhood known as Crawfish Bottom, its people and places, and the processes by which that neighborhood was destroyed by the Frankfort Slum Clearance and Redevelopment Agency, from which the capital city and the Capitol Plaza and the YMCA were born. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you.
Next, we have Lawrence Perry.
Hi. Thank you for the chance to come before you all and offer some ideas. I too have a comment that revolves around mitigation, but it is not mitigation of the two bases for eligibility for the National Register that have been proposed. So this is another way of seeing National Register eligibility. Using the criteria letter, it would be criterion A for the significance under other historic associations than the fraternal organizations in Frankfort. So another aspect which I would like further National Register eligibility consideration to explore is the place of the YMCA within the history of post-World War II construction in Frankfort. Such a study would not be a design-based study. It should be a study of post-war building in Frankfort, which focuses on the public, commercial, and to the extent that it exists, private residential construction in this city. One aspect of this era of construction in Frankfort is becoming quickly apparent. The buildings which once were hailed as social and technical triumphs are quickly being pronounced as unfeasible for continued use. Buildings such as the Capitol Plaza Tower, the Civic Center Arena, the Frankfort Independent School office building on Wilkinson Boulevard are just three such places which have been erected and demolished in my own lifetime. The former Sears store in Eastwood Shopping Center on Versailles Road is another celebrated construction which is now laid empty for years, presumably for its lack of utility. There are many buildings in Frankfort that were constructed between 1945 through the 1970s, including the YMCA, which should be considered in a larger study of post-war construction in Frankfort. Such a study is essential to evaluate what historic value will be lost in the demolition of the YMCA. I would ask that part of the mitigation consideration would be a survey of public and commercial construction in Frankfort from 1945 to 1978, which would produce a historic context report focused on the economic, technical, and social attitudes toward the new types of construction that the YMCA and the larger Capitol Plaza were part of. Such a study is vital to us if we are to understand the forces which lead us in the present day to reject the ways that these buildings, which can be preserved and which declaring them eligible to the National Register says they should be preserved, yet are declared unfit for continued use. The lessons of such a study are essential for us today if we wish to reverse the trend of constructing buildings which have a functional lifespan of no more than 50 years. Please consider a mitigation action which captures more than high-resolution photographs of the Y and a high level of recording of architectural detail. Filing away such an archival record of the YMCA seems a dismissive way to understand the lessons that it has to teach us. Please use this mitigation opportunity to gain some wisdom, which will enable us to recognize better how to make buildings that actually will be preserved, that will last longer than a single human's lifespan. Thank you.
Thank you.
That is all.
That is all. Did anyone else want to speak? Yes, good. That concludes the public hearing. We will be accepting public comment through close of business on Thursday. If anyone in the listening audience wants to send in a comment, we have email addresses for myself, Jennifer Hall, and Blair Hecker. Please feel free to send those comments. Again, we'll be collecting them till close of business on Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.